A father marries his own daughter, but something unexpected happens on the wedding day. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what city you're from. The sun hadn't risen yet when Harold Crawford buttoned his work shirt with weary fingers, his hands still calloused from yesterday's labor. The walls of the small wooden house creaked in the morning silence, and the stale scent of coal dust lingered faintly in the air. He moved with the instinctive caution of a man whose muscles remembered too many years of bending, lifting, and crawling underground. The house was quiet, too quiet for Harold's liking, but it was a sacred kind of quiet, the kind that came just before life stirred. He paused for a moment by the door of his daughter's room. A soft, pink light filtered through the thin curtains, touching the sleeping face of 4-year-old Samantha. Her curls spilled over her pillow like a halo, and her thumb rested just beneath her chin, as it always did when she dreamed. Harold watched her, the ache in his chest both familiar and fresh. He never tired of this moment, the stillness, the proof that despite everything, something good had come into the world. In the kitchen, his wife Loretta was already pouring coffee, her silhouette framed by the oil lamp. She was a small woman with a tired grace about her, the kind of strength that didn't speak unless it had to. Harold kissed her cheek as he passed, and she gave him the kind of smile that held both love and a quiet, constant worry. "You be careful down there," she said, handing him his metal lunch tin. "Storm's supposed to come through this evening." "I'll be all right," Harold replied, touching her hand gently. "Just another night shift." He left the house just as the sky began to change, stars retreating behind the gathering clouds. His boots crunched on gravel as he made his way toward the shuttle bus that would take him and the other miners to the site. The same men every day, faces blackened with soot and hardened by years of labor. They spoke little, saving their breath for the suffocating air below the surface. Harold worked deep underground, where sunlight never touched and the air pressed close against the skin. Hours passed in darkness, broken only by the dim lamps on their helmets and the occasional crackle of the radio. As always, he thought of Samantha, her drawings on the refrigerator, her laugh when he tossed her in the air, the way she called him Daddy, like it was a magic word. He promised himself he'd be home by dawn to see her wake. But when he emerged from the mine, the sky was orange and red, streaked with smoke. A man ran up to the crew shouting, voice hoarse with panic. "Fire on the east side! A house caught! Spread fast!" Harold's stomach clenched. East side. That was where they lived. He didn't wait. He ran, past the others, past the gates, past every warning and shouted command. His boots beat against the road, lungs burning, chest tight, each step thudding like a hammer inside him. Smoke thickened in the air. Then came the sirens, the flashing lights, and the sight that made his knees go weak. His house was gone. What stood in its place was a skeleton of charred wood, still hissing smoke into the morning. Firemen were packing up hoses, shouting instructions, their faces grim. Harold screamed her name. Both their names. Loretta, Samantha. No one stopped him. He tore through the caution tape, stumbled through the ash, choking on the smoke and grief. He clawed at the debris, calling, sobbing, pleading. It was a firefighter who finally caught him by the shoulders and held him back. "There's nothing left, sir. We found 2 bodies." He didn't believe them. Couldn't. Wouldn't. He begged to see them, but the coroner said the remains were too badly burned. A wedding ring had survived. A child's locket. That was all. The funeral was small. No open caskets, no closure. Just 2 boxes, light as air, lowered into the earth. Harold didn't speak during the service. He didn't cry. He sat like stone while neighbors whispered and placed hands on his shoulder. They called it an accident. Electrical, they said, but Harold didn't care why. The why didn't matter. The only two people who ever mattered were gone. Afterward, Harold wandered the town like a ghost. He no longer reported to the mines. He sold nothing, explained nothing. One day, he simply disappeared. He walked out of Georgia under a steel-gray sky with nothing in his hands and nothing left inside him. They never knew that the second body hadn't been Samantha's. She had lived. On the morning of the fire, Samantha had been awake before her mother, playing with a wooden doll on the porch. A truck had pulled up, a stranger with kind eyes and a badge. He told her daddy had sent him. She was too young to know better. He lifted her gently into the cab and drove away. She cried once, and then not again for a long time. The man dropped her off at a different house in another state, where another woman gave her a new name, Maya. She grew up believing her mother had abandoned her, her father never existed. She passed through foster homes like seasons, each one colder than the last. She forgot the fire. She forgot Loretta's voice. She forgot the man who had kissed her forehead every night and whispered, "Sleep tight, little flower." And Harold forgot her, or rather his mind forced him to. The years that followed were a haze. He lived under the name Henry Rhodes in a town whose name he barely remembered. He rented a modest house near the edge of a cemetery, working as groundskeeper and handyman. The townspeople called him quiet, strange, but polite. He never talked about his past. No photos adorned his walls. He kept no phone, no television, only a small radio and his garden. He liked the silence of the dead. It was in silence that the memories stayed buried. Sometimes at night he heard a girl laughing. Sometimes he woke with the scent of smoke in his nose, but when he sat up, heart pounding, there was only the wind and the ticking of the old kitchen clock. He never remarried, never allowed himself to feel. Emotions were dangerous. Emotions made you remember. And then, one spring morning, Maya walked into his life. She was looking for a room to rent, the ad posted on a bulletin board in town. Harold had put it up months ago and forgotten. She knocked on his door, and when he opened it, he felt something strange, like a string pulled tight inside him. She smiled. Her eyes were soft brown, her voice warm. "Hi, I saw your ad." He blinked, nodded, let her in. He didn't know it yet, but the past he'd buried was walking back into his home, step by gentle step. She didn't know it either, that the man offering her a room was the father she never got to know. They were strangers at the threshold of a truth neither of them could yet imagine. And the fire, though long extinguished, had never truly gone out. It had only changed form, and it was about to burn again. The days that followed Maya's arrival settled into a rhythm as gentle and strange as the way spring light moved across the wooden floors of Henry Rhodes's home. She had taken the small room at the back, the one that faced the garden and smelled faintly of jasmine in the early mornings. She paid rent on time, cleaned up after herself, and offered to cook once in a while, even though he never asked. There was something unspoken between them from the start, an odd familiarity neither could name, like hearing a song from a dream and not remembering the words. Henry, who had long ago stopped letting people close, found himself saying yes to little things. Yes to coffee at the kitchen table. Yes to letting her help weed the rose beds. Yes to the way she left her shoes by the door and didn't disturb the silence he'd come to rely on. Her presence was soft, but it stirred something dormant in him. He didn't have a name for it. He didn't want one. Maya didn't ask many questions either. She respected the stillness of the house and the careful way Henry moved through it. He was quiet, but not cold, distant, but not indifferent. Sometimes she caught him looking at her when he thought she wouldn't notice, not in a way that made her uneasy, but with a strange intensity that unsettled her for reasons she couldn't explain. Once, as she handed him a cup of tea, their fingers brushed, and his eyes lingered on hers a moment too long. Something flickered behind them, a recognition perhaps, but it vanished before she could grasp it. She told herself it was nothing. Just an old man, lonely and kind, who had spent too long in his own company. Yet, when she walked past the garden shed at night and heard the low hum of a record player or the soft cadence of a man talking to himself, she felt a strange pressure in her chest, as though the house held more memory than its walls could contain. Henry's life before her arrival was a study in routine. He woke with the sun, drank bitter coffee in silence, tended to the graves, trimmed the hedges, watered the rose bushes, and read the same 3 books in a cycle he never broke. He cooked simply: grits and eggs, black-eyed peas, cornbread. He lived as though the world outside his gate didn't exist. But now there was Maya. She brought life in without intending to. She laughed at old movies. She played gospel music while she cleaned. She danced once in the kitchen when she thought he wasn't watching, and something in him cracked open so suddenly he had to step outside. One Sunday afternoon she asked him about the garden. He paused, pruning shears in hand, then nodded toward the roses. "They don't like too much water," he said. "Gotta learn the rhythm. Too much, they drown. Too little, they dry." She knelt beside him, pulling on gloves. "Like people, huh?" He didn't respond, but she saw the faint curve of a smile on his face. In the weeks that followed, Maya learned the pattern of the land. She helped him with planting, mulching, cleaning the headstones. She liked the quiet of the cemetery, the way it felt removed from time. She never asked about the names on the stones or why Henry touched one particular grave every morning before starting his work. She respected his silences, and, in turn, he began to offer her slivers of himself. He told her about his years in the mines, just the work, never the people. He spoke of the smell of coal dust and the way the earth groaned when it shifted. He told her about the time a tunnel collapsed, trapping 6 men for 14 hours. How quiet it had been, how still. He didn't speak of what came before or after. She didn't push. Maya found herself drawn to him in ways that confused her. It wasn't romantic, not at first. It was deeper than that. An odd, gravitational pull, like the way her dreams had shifted since moving in. She had started dreaming of fire, of a woman's voice calling her name, of smoke and sirens and a man's arms lifting her into the air. She woke with tears on her face and no memory of why. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the kitchen and found Henry already there, nursing a cup of tea in the dark. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. He shook his head. "Some nights are too quiet." She sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her own mug. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just full. She wanted to ask him about his past, but something in his expression stopped her. "Do you believe people can forget things on purpose?" she said instead. Henry stared into his cup for a long time. "I think sometimes the mind decides for us. Some things are too heavy to carry. Have you ever forgotten something that mattered?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. She didn't ask again. In the months that followed, their connection deepened in quiet ways. Maya found herself thinking of him during her shifts at the clinic. She began bringing home small things, a book she thought he'd like, a pie from the bakery, a new packet of seeds. He, in turn, began to keep her favorite tea stocked and fixed her broken lamp without being asked. Their lives wound around each other slowly, like vines finding structure. Neighbors noticed. An old woman at the market made a comment about how unusual it was, the two of them living alone in that house. Henry didn't react, but Maya saw the flicker in his eyes. She hated how people stared at them sometimes, whispered just loud enough to be heard, as if kindness and connection between an old black man and a young black woman could only be one thing. But Maya didn't care. Not really. Not until the night he touched her cheek in the garden and whispered, "You deserve more than this world's given you." The tenderness of it startled her. She didn't know how to respond. That night, she lay awake wondering what it meant, whether it was affection or something else, whether the ache in her chest when she looked at him was longing or something older, something nameless. Henry lay awake too, tormented by dreams he couldn't remember and a memory that stirred at the edges of thought. He had felt this before, this closeness, this pull, but every time he tried to trace it, it slipped through his fingers like water. He began to write again, poems mostly, fragments of songs. He wrote about fire and gardens and loss. He didn't show them to her, but he left one tucked under a stone by the rosebush she tended every morning. She found it the next day. "You are the echo of something I once held, the scent of smoke in spring's first bloom, and though I forget, my hands remember." She held the paper for a long time, pressing it to her chest. That evening, as the sun set behind the cemetery, she joined him on the porch. "Henry," she said, her voice quiet, "do you ever think some people are meant to find each other again?" He looked at her, eyes shadowed by something old and unfathomable. "I think some things," he said slowly, "never truly leave us." She didn't know what he meant, not yet, but the words lodged deep inside her like a seed waiting for rain. And as the days grew longer and the garden bloomed with a beauty neither of them could explain, something began to grow between them, fragile, unnamed, and utterly impossible, but real. So real that it hurt to breathe sometimes. They didn't know yet that the truth was already growing too, buried deep, waiting. The summer arrived with a heavy breath, curling heat into the corners of the old house, filling the garden with the scent of warm earth and blooming roses. Time moved slowly, folding itself into the rituals of long days and quiet evenings. Henry and Maya settled deeper into a rhythm that defied explanation, a bond that neither of them could name, but both felt with increasing intensity. It wasn't romance, not in the way the world defined it, but it wasn't familial either. It was a tether, a gravity, a warmth that settled into the bones and made them ache when the other was too far away. Maya had stopped wondering what others thought. She had grown used to the stares, the sidelong glances, the unspoken questions that lingered in the air when they walked together through town. She no longer flinched at the insinuations. She only knew that when she looked at Henry, she saw someone who made her feel safe, seen, and inexplicably whole. And for a woman who had lived most of her life in fragments, that feeling was something sacred. Henry, for his part, was caught in a quiet war with his own soul. He had lived for decades behind walls of silence and routine, convinced that feeling too deeply would only awaken the grief he had buried so long ago. But Maya was not something he could keep at arm's length. She moved through the rooms of his life like sunlight through lace, uninvited but welcomed, soft and undeniable. When she smiled, he felt something inside him shift, as though a door, long rusted shut, had creaked open just enough to let in air. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, studying the curve of her jaw, the way she tilted her head when reading, the gentle strength in her hands as she worked the soil. There were moments, too many now, when her presence made his throat tighten, when the back of his eyes burned with something he didn't understand. It was more than affection. It was something older, deeper, something his body seemed to remember even as his mind failed to place it. They began to spend more time in the garden. Maya had taken a particular interest in the hydrangeas, coaxing them into bloom with the same gentle tenacity she applied to everything in her life. Henry taught her how to care for the lavender and prune the roses without wounding them. They worked side by side in companionable silence, their hands dirty, their hearts slowly unraveling. One evening, as they sat on the porch sipping sweet tea and watching the sky darken into indigo, Maya turned to him and said, "I never told you, but I've started applying for nursing school." Henry looked at her, pride flickering in his tired eyes. "You'd be good at that." She smiled. "I hope so. I've always wanted to help people, maybe because nobody ever really helped me growing up." He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He understood the weight of abandonment, the hollow places where family should have been. "Some of us," he said, "get handed empty hands. We have to fill them ourselves." She nodded, and silence stretched between them like a bridge. Later that night, as she lay in bed, she found herself wondering about her past more than usual. Something about this place, this man, had stirred an old ache in her. She had never known her real parents. The story was always vague. Her mother was young and unfit, her father unknown. She had bounced from foster home to foster home until she turned 18 and aged out of the system. After that, she had only herself. But lately, she had started to wonder if she had been told the truth at all. There were gaps in the story, pieces that didn't add up. She had no photos, no birth certificate, only a name that had changed when she was 4. A social worker once mentioned something about a fire, but Maya had been too young to remember anything clearly. Just flashes, heat, noise, a voice shouting her name. She hadn't thought about it in years, but now the memories were beginning to surface like old bones pushed up by the tide. She started dreaming again, more vivid now. A woman singing to her in a kitchen, a man lifting her into the air and calling her little flower, the scent of roses, the sound of a clock ticking in the dark. Maya couldn't explain why, but the dreams unsettled her. They didn't feel like dreams. They felt like memories. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves in the living room, she found an old photo tucked behind a stack of gardening books. It was curled at the edges, faded with time. It showed a young man in miner's gear standing in front of a small house. He looked proud, happy. There was a woman beside him, laughing, holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 4. Maya stared at the photo for a long time. Her heart beat faster. Something about the girl's eyes felt familiar. She waited until Henry had gone into town, then searched the drawers and cupboards with shaken hands. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, something, anything, but what she found was more than she could have imagined. In a box beneath his bed, carefully wrapped in cloth, were 3 items: a scorched silver locket, a torn piece of a child's dress, and a small wooden doll with one arm missing. Maya sat on the floor, holding the doll in her lap, her breath shallow. She had seen this doll before. She didn't know how, but she had. When Henry returned, she was back in her room, the box untouched where she had found it. She didn't say anything, not yet. Instead, she began to watch him more closely, the way his hand trembled when he passed certain dates on the calendar, the way he stared into space as though listening to voices long gone, the way he sometimes whispered a name in his sleep. Samantha. The name bloomed in her mind like a bruise. One evening, after they had finished dinner, she brought out the photograph. "I found this," she said, her voice careful. "Is this your family?" Henry took the photo with slow hands. His eyes scanned the image, and for a moment he looked as though he might break. He said nothing, just nodded. "Who's the little girl?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his face unreadable. "My daughter," he said. She waited, but he didn't continue. "What happened to her?" He set the photo down, his hand lingering on the edge. "She died, a long time ago, in a fire." Maya felt something cold pass through her. "Were you there?" He shook his head. "I was working. Came back and it was too late." She watched him closely. His eyes were far away. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded and the conversation ended. But in her mind, something had begun to take root. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The doll sat on her nightstand, a silent witness. She thought about the dreams, the photo, the things he had never said. She thought about the way he looked at her sometimes, with wonder and sorrow all tangled up in one expression. The next morning, she called in sick to work and drove to the public library in town. She pulled records, searched archives, typed names into old computer databases. She found an article from a small-town paper dated over 20 years ago. House fire claims mother and daughter. Only the daughter's name was listed. Samantha Crawford. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the article. There was a photo, a man in miner's gear, the same man from the picture in Henry's house. She clicked on a second link. Obituary. Loretta Crawford, survived by husband Harold. She stared at the name. Harold Crawford. Her vision blurred. Henry was Harold. And Samantha was... She couldn't breathe. She stumbled out of the library, the sun too bright, the world too loud. Everything inside her was turning over, rewriting itself. She drove back in silence, the road a blur beneath her tires. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the garden until dawn, the doll in her hands, the truth heavy in her chest. Henry, Harold, her father. She didn't know how it was possible, how the universe had twisted itself into this cruel, impossible knot. But she knew it was true, and she didn't know what to do next. Maya moved through the house like a shadow, silent and watchful, her eyes tracing the corners of rooms that now felt unfamiliar. Every object, every photograph, every whispered memory clung to the walls with a new, unbearable weight. The knowledge she carried pressed against her chest like a stone, and yet she said nothing. Not yet. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how. How did one look into the eyes of a man who had unknowingly offered her love, safety, a future, and tell him that she was his child? She told herself she needed time to process, to be certain, to gather proof, though her heart already knew. She told herself that if she just waited, the right words would come. But days passed, and silence became the only thing she could trust. Henry noticed the change in her. He watched her with quiet concern as she moved through her routines with a strange, practiced detachment. She no longer laughed at old movies. She no longer asked him to walk with her through the garden. There was a distance now, one he couldn't name, but felt in the way her smile no longer reached her eyes. He blamed himself. He thought perhaps he had said too much or not enough. He wondered if he had crossed some invisible line, if the strange tenderness between them had frightened her. He didn't dare speak it aloud. There were things he had never allowed himself to want, and Maya had awakened all of them. The longing, the comfort, the quiet ache for something more than survival. And now, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was slipping away. One evening, while the sun spilled its last golden light across the kitchen floor, Maya placed her hands on the table and said softly, "I think we need to talk." Henry looked up from the paper he hadn't been reading. "I'm not feeling well," she said, avoiding his eyes. "I think I need to take some time, maybe postpone the wedding." The words hung in the air like smoke. The silence that followed was long, but not empty. It was full of all the things neither of them could say. Henry nodded slowly. "If that's what you need." She expected him to protest, to ask why, but he didn't. He simply folded the paper and rose to wash his mug, his movements slow and careful, as though anything sudden might break the moment. "I'll be here," he said after a while without turning around. "You don't have to explain." Maya wanted to cry. She wanted to scream, to tell him the truth, to collapse into his arms and be his daughter again. But she couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she left the room and went to sit in the garden, her fingers twisting the edge of her dress as dusk crept over the land. The flowers had begun to wilt in the heat. The roses drooped heavy with bloom. The hydrangeas were browning at the edges. She hadn't tended them in days. She thought of the dreams again, the woman's voice singing to her, the smell of smoke, the sound of someone calling her little flower. The memories came more easily now, flowing like water from a cracked dam. She saw a kitchen with faded wallpaper, a table with mismatched chairs, a man's hands lifting her high above the floor, her laughter echoing in the walls. She whispered the name to herself, Harold. The next morning, she woke early and wandered into the shed. She opened the old chest again and looked at the doll, the dress, the locket. She touched them as if for the first time. They no longer felt like artifacts of someone else's story. They were hers. She could remember now the feel of the doll's wooden arm beneath her cheek as she fell asleep, the way the locket had tickled her chest when she ran. Her name hadn't always been Maya. She had been Samantha once. She took the doll with her and placed it on her bedside table, a quiet totem of the truth she could no longer avoid. Later that week, she received an envelope in the mail, a thick, official-looking packet. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was the full report from the DNA lab, 2 names printed in bold letters, Maya Thompson, Harold Crawford, biological relationship, 99.9% probability, father and daughter. Her stomach turned, her vision blurred. The weight of the confirmation crushed what little denial she had left. She sat for hours on the edge of her bed, the paper clutched in her hands, the air in the room too thick to breathe. By the time the sun dipped low again, she had made a decision. She couldn't marry him. She couldn't let this go any further. She had to stop it before it was too late. But how could she tell him without destroying him? Henry, Harold, had spent years burying the pain of losing his family. And now, without knowing, he had opened his heart to the very child he thought he'd lost. What would the truth do to him? She wandered outside and sat on the porch. Henry joined her a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of tea. He didn't speak, just handed her one and settled into the chair beside her. The silence between them was thick with everything unspoken. After a long pause, he said, Do you ever feel like time is playing a trick on you?" She looked at him, startled. "Like the past isn't behind you," he continued, "but right there, just out of reach, like it's watching you." She nodded slowly. "All the time." He sipped his tea, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. "I keep thinking about the wedding," he said, "and how strange it feels. Not wrong, just strange." Maya felt her breath catch. "I've been alone for so long," he went on. "I didn't think I'd ever feel connected to anyone again. And then you came, and I thought maybe it was a second chance." She looked down at her hands. "It was never supposed to be like this," she whispered. He turned to her. "Then how was it supposed to be?" She couldn't answer. That night, she'd packed a small bag. She didn't leave. Not yet. But she placed it by the door just in case. She didn't know where she would go. She only knew she couldn't stay much longer. The next morning, she found him in the kitchen, humming softly to himself. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," he said, "maybe we should go through with it." She froze. "I know you said you weren't feeling well, but maybe it's fear. Maybe we're both scared. And maybe that means we're doing something real." Her heart pounded. "You don't understand," she began, but he shook his head. "I don't need to," he said. "I just know that since you came into my life, I've felt like a man again, not a ghost." She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. That evening, he showed her the rings. Simple gold bands. He had ordered them weeks ago. She didn't know how to say no without unraveling him. The next day, she visited the church. The pastor, an elderly man with kind eyes, greeted her warmly. She told him about Harold, about the memory loss, the grief, the hallucinations. She didn't tell him the whole truth, only that Harold believed he was marrying someone he had loved long ago, and she wanted to give him peace. The pastor was touched. He agreed to officiate a simple ceremony, just the three of them. He called it a gesture of grace. Maya didn't feel graceful. She felt sick. Back at the house, she found the old wedding dress in a trunk in the attic, yellowed with age, delicate with lace and stitched pearls. It smelled like dust and lavender. She held it against her chest and sobbed. The night before the wedding, Harold was restless. He moved through the house like a man chasing ghosts. He whispered to himself, stared at old photos, touched the walls like they were sacred. Maya sat by the window, holding the dress in her lap, the locket around her neck, the truth burning in her throat. In 3 days, he had said, she would return from Paris with the dress. And now, 3 days had passed. She was returning, but not as a wife. As a daughter who had already lost too much. As a child who had once been lifted in his arms and called Little Flower. And soon she would have to choose between mercy and truth. But the bells had already begun to ring. The morning of the wedding arrived with a stillness that felt almost reverent. The air was heavy with humidity, thick enough to press against the skin, and yet the garden was quiet, as if it too were holding its breath. Maya stood at her window in the faded wedding dress, staring at her reflection in the mirror, and saw not a bride, but a ghost. The lace draped her shoulders like cobwebs, and the locket she had found rested just below the hollow of her throat, the same one that had once hung from the neck of a child who had been taken in the night and erased from her own story. The church ceremony had been arranged with simplicity in mind. No guests, no music, no flowers other than the ones Harold had brought from the garden himself. It was to be a quiet thing, a private exchange between a man and a woman, but beneath the stillness a storm churned. Maya could feel it rising in her throat, pushing against her rib cage. She had lived with the truth for days now, holding it like a burning coal. But the closer the moment came, the more uncertain she felt. Every plan she had made to stop this, to tell him, to run, to reveal the horror, seemed to melt in the heat of his fragile joy. Harold had been transformed. In the last 3 days he had moved through the house with the wide-eyed wonder of a man reborn. He smiled again. He hummed to himself. He spoke to her with the warmth of someone who believed in magic. She watched him arrange the gardenias into a bouquet and felt her stomach twist. There was a radiance in his eyes she hadn't seen before, and behind that radiance, a shadow that terrified her. The shadow of a mind teetering on the edge of memory and madness. She had almost told him the night before. He had sat on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one, his hands folded in his lap, the rings resting in a small wooden box beside him. She had walked out, the locket in her hand, the words ready to fall from her lips. But when he looked up at her, the joy in his eyes struck her dumb. He looked so much like the man in her dreams, the father who had lifted her above the flames, who had called her his little flower, who had disappeared into the smoke, the man she had searched for in every corner of her life without knowing what she was looking for. Instead of the truth, she had said, "You should get some rest. Tomorrow's a big day." He had smiled at her then, the kind of smile that held an entire lifetime in it. She had turned away before he could see her cry. Now, as the morning light spilled across the floor, she slipped on her shoes with trembling hands and walked down the stairs. Harold was waiting by the door, dressed in a suit that looked as though it hadn't been worn in decades. It hung loose on his frame, but his posture was proud, his face lit with anticipation. "You look beautiful," he said. Maya nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He held out his arm, and she took it. The church was only a short walk from the house. The street was quiet, the neighbors watching from behind their curtains, their faces unreadable. Maya couldn't tell if they suspected the truth or simply judged the strangeness of what they saw. An old man walking to a church in a suit, his bride young enough to be his daughter. They stepped inside, and the cool air wrapped around them like a balm. The pastor stood waiting at the altar, a gentle smile on his lips. He had prepared no sermon, only a few words of blessing and the exchange of vows. He believed he was participating in a mercy, a kindness to an old man losing his mind. The ceremony began. Maya stood across from Harold, her hands trembling in his, the locket pressing against her skin like a brand. The pastor spoke in soft, reverent tones. Harold repeated the words with a quiet strength that startled her. When it came time for her to speak, she hesitated. She could end it now, one word, one truth, but her lips moved on their own. "I do." The pastor nodded. He turned to Harold. "You may kiss the bride." Maya froze. Harold leaned forward. She closed her eyes, but something stopped him. He pulled back suddenly, his hands falling away from hers. His eyes widened, his face blanching. Maya opened her eyes to find him staring at her, not with love, but with terror. "No," he said. His voice cracked the silence of the chapel. "No, not you." He took a step back, then another, his body shaking. "You're her," he whispered. "You're my daughter." The words fell into the space between them like thunder. Maya's breath caught in her throat. "I remember," Harold said, louder now, his voice trembling. "The fire, the doll, the dress. You were 4 years old. Samantha. Your name was Samantha." He fell to his knees. Maya rushed to him, but he recoiled. "No!" he shouted. Don't touch me." The pastor moved forward, confused. but Maya held up a hand. "It's true," she said softly. "I found out a few weeks ago. I didn't know until recently." Harold stared at her, the horror etched into every line of his face. "You knew," he whispered, "and you didn't tell me." She shook her head. "I tried. I wanted to. I didn't know how." Tears streamed down his face. "I thought you were gone," he said. "I buried you. I let them tell me you were dead. And now you wear your mother's dress and stand in her place and, God forgive me." He covered his face with his hands. "I didn't know," she repeated. "I didn't know either." The pastor stepped back, silent. Harold rose slowly, his body trembling, his face a mask of anguish. "I have to leave," he said. "Please don't," Maya whispered. He turned to her, eyes red. "I lost you once, and now I've lost you again. But this time, it's worse, because this time I loved you and didn't even know who you were." He walked out of the church, the doors creaking shut behind him. Maya stood alone at the altar, her hands empty, her heart shattered. Later that night, he didn't come home. She waited by the window, the locket still around her neck, the wedding dress still clinging to her skin like a wound. At dawn, she packed her bag and left. The house stood silent behind her, the garden overgrown, the rings still resting in the box on the porch. The house stood in stillness after Maya's departure, its walls once filled with quiet rituals and bloomin' life now echoing with an absence too loud to ignore. The morning sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, touching the faded furniture and the garden tools left on the porch, casting long shadows across a silence that felt heavier than grief. The chair where Harold used to sit with his tea remained untouched. The cup he had left beside it had dried at the bottom, the stain of bitter leaves crusted to porcelain. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no gospel music from the kitchen, no laughter outside by the roses. Maya was gone. Harold had not returned after the wedding. The doors of the church had closed behind him, and he had vanished into the town like mist into sunlight. He had walked without direction, past the cemetery gates, down roads he had long forgotten, through alleys where no one looked at him, across bridges that trembled beneath his weight. His shoes were scuffed, his suit wrinkled, and the look on his face made strangers turn away without knowing why. He did not cry. Not in the street. Not that day. He ended up in a motel on the edge of town, a place where the carpet smelled of mold and the clerk didn't ask for a name. He paid in cash, kept the blinds shut, and sat on the edge of the bed for hours without moving. The television remained off. The lamp, flickering weakly in the corner, cast a yellow pallor over his skin. He did not sleep that first night. He simply sat, his mind spiraling through the fragments of a past he could no longer suppress. He saw the fire. He saw the ash. He saw the doll in the child's bed and the ring on Loretta's hand. He remembered the way his heart had stopped when he was told both bodies were unrecognizable. He had nodded then, signed the papers, believed the lie because believing anything else would have broken him. But now the truth was uncoiled before him like a serpent, and he could not look away. His daughter was alive. She had been alive all along. And somehow, impossibly, he had found her again. Not as a child, not as a memory, but as a woman grown, with hands that looked like her mother's, and eyes that once called him Daddy. And he, blind with loneliness and age, had seen her not for who she was, but for who he needed her to be. Not a daughter, a second chance, a companion to ease the weight of his years. The shame was a living thing inside him. He tried to remember the moment it began, the first time his feelings had turned. He could not. The line had blurred so gradually, so gently, like mist over glass. There had never been malice, but that made it worse. What was worse than ignorance, than a love born from blindness? He thought of the locket, the doll, the dress, all the signs that had been there, and he cursed himself for not seeing them sooner. He thought of her silence, her hesitation, her sorrow in the days before the wedding. She had known, and she had not told him, because she had been trying to protect him. That broke him more than the truth. On the third night, he began to write. The paper was thin, the pen shaky in his hand, but he wrote slowly, carefully, forcing each word out like breath from drowning lungs. He wrote to her, not as a bride, not as a stranger, but as a little girl he had once tucked into bed, as a daughter he had lost and the woman he had failed to recognize. He wrote of Loretta, of her laughter, her songs, the way she used to stand at the window each morning just to watch the clouds move. He wrote of the fire, of the pain, of the hole it had left in him. He wrote of the way he had tried to forget, had needed to forget in order to keep living. He confessed that he had become someone else not to escape her memory, but to survive it. He told her he forgave her. He begged her to forgive him. He folded the letter with hands that trembled and sealed it in an envelope, her name written on the front in the careful, slanted script of a man who hadn't written to anyone in decades. He didn't know where to send it. She had left no address, no number, no forwarding path. All that remained were memories and the things she had left behind. The doll, the dress, a scarf on the back of the kitchen chair, a teacup with a lipstick stain on the rim. He returned to the house 2 days later, moving through the rooms like a visitor. Everything smelled faintly of lavender and dust. He opened windows, let in air. He found the rings still in the wooden box, untouched. He did not cry when he saw them. Instead, he placed them in a drawer and closed it quietly. In the evenings, he sat on the porch with a notebook in his lap and watched the garden return to life. He trimmed the roses. He watered the lavender. He pulled weeds with the patience of a man who had nowhere left to be. He wrote every day, to Maya, to Samantha, to Loretta, to the man he had once been. He wrote letters he would never send, pouring into them the things he could not say aloud. Regrets, confessions, memories. In one, he described the sound of her laugh when she was a baby, how it had sounded like wind chimes in a summer storm. In another, he described the day he had buried the locket in the garden, how he had prayed she'd somehow return to find it. In another still, he thanked her for coming back, even if only for a little while. Weeks passed. Then, one morning, he found an envelope tucked under the mat at the door. There was no return address, only his name. His fingers trembled as he opened it. The handwriting inside was hers. Dear Dad, I wasn't sure if I should write. I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me or if it would make things worse. But I kept thinking about all the things we didn't say, about the moments we had that were real, even if the truth wasn't known. I wanted you to know that I don't blame you, not for not recognizing me, not for how things unfolded. I believe you were trying to love in the only way you knew how. I believe you would never have hurt me if you had known, and I forgive you with all my heart. You gave me a home, even when you didn't know who I was. You gave me safety. You gave me a garden. I will carry that with me, wherever I go. Please take care of yourself. Your daughter, Samantha. He read the letter 3 times. He pressed it to his chest and closed his eyes. And then, for the first time since the fire, He wept without shame. The tears fell freely, washing away the ashes that had lived in him for so long. He wept for Loretta, for Samantha, for Harold, for Henry, for the years that had been lost and the memories that had survived. That night, he wrote back. He placed the letter beneath the oak tree where the swing used to hang, beside the rose bush Maya had planted. He didn't know if she would return to find it, but he believed she would feel it, somehow. He walked to the garden in the dark, touching the petals with his fingertips, whispering names into the wind. He was not healed. He would never be whole. But he was no longer silent. And in the spaces between the pain, something softer had begun to grow. Something like peace. He didn't know if he would see her again, but he would wait. He had waited once before. He could wait again. The seasons moved slowly after Samantha's letter, as though time itself had grown cautious in the wake of such revelation. Summer drifted into autumn with golden reluctance, and the garden that once bloomed under Maya's hands softened into a hush of fallen petals and tired leaves. The house had resumed its rhythm, but it was no longer the rhythm of absence or despair. It was a quiet one, deliberate and purposeful, the way a man breathes after holding his breath for too long. Harold, no longer Henry in his heart, rose early each morning and tended to the earth. The tools he once abandoned in sorrow were back in use, though his hands had lost their surety and trembled slightly with age. The garden had become more than a space of labor. It was a place of prayer, of remembrance, of communion with the things he had nearly let die inside him. Every weed he pulled, every seed he planted, was part of a penance that no one had asked of him but which he felt compelled to serve. He planted a tree. He did it on a morning when the air was cool and the sky stretched wide with the pale light of early fall. He had chosen a spot near the back of the garden, just beyond the row of lavender that Maya, Samantha, had once cared for. It was a young oak, barely more than a sapling, its trunk slender, its leaves like shy green hands reaching toward the sun. He dug the hole slowly, reverently, the way someone might dig a grave, though this time it was for life, not loss. The soil was rich, dark, forgiving. As he lowered the roots into the earth, he whispered her name, not the name she had come with, but the one he had given her at birth. Samantha. Little flower. His hands trembled, but not from weakness, from reverence. When the last shovelful of dirt was in place, he sat beside the tree and breathed. It had been so long since he had allowed himself the stillness of creation, so long since he had made something that would last beyond him. This tree, he thought, would not burn. Not like the house, not like the past. It would stand. It would grow. It would carry something of her, of him, of the things they had lost and found again in pain. Every morning after that, he brought water to the tree. He spoke to it sometimes, softly, as though it could understand. Sometimes he read to it from the letters she had written, or the ones he had written back. He had never sent another, but he had not stopped writing. He filled pages with memories, stories, dreams. Some he tucked into a jar and buried near the roots. Others he kept in a box beneath his bed. He didn't expect her to return, but he didn't live in the shadow of that hope either. It was no longer about waiting. It was about living with the knowing, carrying her presence in the soil and sky and wind. She was here, in a way that could not be touched or measured, but was real nonetheless. On her birthday, he baked a pie. Apple, her favorite. He placed it on the table with 2 plates, 2 forks, and a candle in the center. He did not sing. He simply sat in the chair she used to occupy, closed his eyes, and said her name, Samantha. The wind rustled the curtains. Sometimes, when the ache in his bones was too great, he took the path behind the cemetery and sat by the river, where the water moved slow and steady, the way time did when you stopped chasing it. He would bring a book or a jar of jam and bread, and sometimes he would bring nothing at all. It wasn't the destination that mattered. It was the motion, the act of being a man who still walked, who still breathed, who still gave. He met people again, slowly, cautiously. The grocer began greeting him by name. The librarian remembered his favorite poets. The children from the school nearby waved to him when he passed, and he waved back, sometimes handing them flowers from the garden. One day, a little girl with a hair like Maya's offered him a drawing, a house, a tree, a man with a smile. He took it, folded it carefully, and placed it in his shirt pocket over his heart. He had not forgiven himself, not completely. Some days the shame clung to him like damp cloth, and he would sit in the garden and weep when no one could see. But other days there was lightness. There was clarity. He would remember the way she had laughed when he taught her to prune roses, the way she had hummed while cleaning, the way she had looked at him before she knew. He had loved her, and she had loved him. Not as a father, not at first. But somehow in that twisted journey toward truth, they had arrived at a kind of love that transcended the name it bore. It was not romantic, not anymore. It was not rooted in fantasy. It was something ancient and inexplicable. Blood calling to blood, soul recognizing soul. One morning, he found another letter. It was tucked under a stone near the tree. It wasn't long. I'm alive. I'm healing. I'm grateful. I think of you when I see sunflowers. Your daughter, always. S. He read it again and again. He pressed it to his lips and whispered a thank you to the sky. That night, he lit a candle by the tree and sat beside it in silence. He closed his eyes and remembered her hands, her eyes, her voice. He remembered Loretta, the way she had danced in the kitchen, the way she had once whispered to him, "She's got your spirit, you know." He smiled. It had been a long road, a terrible road, but he was still here, and so was she. The garden bloomed again in spring. Lavender, roses, tulips, hydrangeas, all blossomed with a wildness that felt almost sacred. The oak tree grew strong, its trunk thickening, its branches stretching higher each day. Birds nested in its limbs. Children played in its shade. Harold watched them from the porch, a book in his lap, his eyes soft. He no longer felt like a ghost. He was not a father in the way the world defined it. He had failed, lost, grieved, but he had also found and listened and loved, and that, he believed, counted for something. He continued to write. The final letter he placed beneath the tree was short. If you return, the garden is yours. If you don't, I will keep it growing. The tree does not burn. Love, Dad. He stood beneath the oak and watched its leaves shimmer in the afternoon light. The breeze lifted through the branches, rustling like a whisper. Somewhere, far from this place, his daughter was alive. And he, Harold Crawford, was no longer waiting to be forgiven. He was simply remembering, simply loving. And the tree, rooted deep in the soil of sorrow and hope, stood tall, unburned, reaching ever upward toward the sky. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos and feel free to share this one with someone who needs to see it.